work one day, and I got to pick this letter up out of my mailbox. I was, by this time, a single mother with 2 children. I pick up this letter out of my mailbox, and it says, "We understand that you have volunteered for astronaut training. Would you appear, would you, be in Albuquerque on such and such a date at such and such a time?" I was really, I thought to myself, when did I do this? The reason that they even called on us was because we were much smaller than those men, those big old boys. And our capabilities, payload capabilities, were practically nil. We just had a Redstone rocket. If you've ever seen a Redstone rocket, if you've been to Cape Canaveral and you go out to the rocket garden, you see these procession of rockets that they started with. The Redstone is a baby. It looks like a firecracker. Well, that's all we had. We lived in Amarillo during the Dust Bowl, and my dad was an oil man. And my first airplane ride was when I was 4 years old. We flew from Amarillo to Austin. At that time they had the statewide oil hearing every month. And Dad decided to take me to one of the oil hearings with him. And his friend Tom Braniff, who later on Braniff Airways, loaned him his Lockheed Electra. And there was a pilot and a co-pilot and a stewardess on board, and Dad and I. And so we got in the plane, and of course I was all excited about flying because I had been going to the movies on Saturday. My mother would take me, and they used to have cereals. And my favorite cereal was about Tailspin Tommy and his girlfriend, Shirley. And she was a pilot, too. So, I grew up thinking women could fly, and nobody thought anything about it. But we get in the airplane, and as we get airborne, the pilot comes back and asks me if I wanted to come up in the cockpit and help him fly the plane. Well, of course I did. And I went up there, and he sat me in his lap, and planes weren't as complicated then. And flying wasn't as complicated then as it is now. And there's not that much traffic. So I sat up there, and he showed me the compass, and told me to... he handed me the control wheel and told me to keep the compass heading, which sort of flew all over the sky, but that was all right. And I had a marvelous time, and I got to sit there all the way to Austin. And just before we landed, the hostess came up and got me and took me back and sat me down with Dad. And I told Dad, I said, "I've been flying this airplane." And he said, "Well, when you grow up, if you'll study hard and become a nurse," because if you were a hostess then had to be registered nurses. And he said, "and become a nurse, then you can fly all the time. Mr. Braniff will let you fly on some of his airliners as a hostess." And I remember being so insulted. I was so insulted when Daddy even thought about me being a hostess. I said, "Well, I don't want to be a hostess. I'm going to fly airplanes. I'm going to fly one just like this one. I've been flying this one, and I intend to continue this as what I'm going to do when I grow up." And Dad turned to me and told me what was fact in those days. And he said, "Well, honey, gals just don't fly airplanes. That's a man's job." And I said, "Well, I'm going to." I was a very stubborn child. And from that day on, I was determined that I was going to fly. I slipped out and started taking flying lessons without my mom knowing about it. I'd save up my money and go take 30 minutes, It's all I could afford. And then my mother caught me coming in one day. I had on a pair of overalls because I was taking flying lessons in an open cockpit plane. This was during World War II. And they didn't have a lot of trainers available for civilians, and I loved every minute of it because then I got to wear a helmet and goggles. I raised heck with my dad when I was a kid, when we got back, to go get me a helmet and goggles like the aviators wore in Tailspin Tommy, until he finally went out to Tradewin Airport in Amarillo and got me some old beat-up helmet and goggles. I wore it to school, and my mother put Shirley Temple curls in my hair every morning. And the minute I'd get away from her, I'd take that helmet and cram it down over those curls and pretend like I was flying when I walked to school. I had to be very careful because I knew that my mother wouldn't approve of this, nor my father, because I was an only child, and that wasn't the plan that they had for me. I'm afraid I was a maverick. They just didn't. That just wasn't in the cards for me, and I knew it. So when they caught me, they sent me off to a girls' school for a whole semester. I had to go off to girls' school and contemplate my sins, which all I did was try to figure out how I could get back and take lessons. I remember seeing the Wasp walk down the streets of Amarillo for the first time, and I told my mother was in the car, and I said, "My gosh, Mother, they're taking women in the Air Force." This was during the war, you know. And she explained to me they were the women's service pilots, you know. And I said, "Well, that's what I'm going to do when I get out of school. That's what I'm going to do." Of course, by the time I got out of school, the war was over, and they disbanded the Wasp almost immediately and told them pretty much to go home and forget about it. I finally got to finish up when I got here, got my private license, and then I got my commercial license and my instructor rating and all of that, and was very fortunate in that I got to ferry some airplanes to build up flying time for Cessna. And then another reason I was very fortunate is I had twin cousins, men who were out in the oil business in Midland, who had airplanes. One had a Bonanza and one had a 310, and they were so proud of me for flying, they let me borrow them and race their airplanes. If you wanted to fly professionally, you had to have a lot of hours. You have to have 200 hours to even start on your commercial pilot's license. And so the way women could do that, unless you just wanted to go up and bore holes in the sky, would be to race airplanes. I had met on an air race, the Transcontinental Air Race, Jerry Cobb, who by this time, Jerry had a very good job with Aero Commander, and she was up in Tulsa. And so she called me one day and she asked me if I could get away for a top secret government project. I felt like, well, this must be really important or she wouldn't call me. So she didn't tell me, and of course when you're doing secret work, there's a thing called need to know. If you need to know, you're told. If you don't need to know, you're not told. You don't ask. So I didn't ask her what it was. I just said, "Yeah, okay, Jerry, I'll get away. If, you know, whatever it is, I'll get away." She says, "Okay, I'll be back in contact with you." I didn't hear any more from her for a year. Came home from work one day, and I got to pick this letter up out of my mailbox. I was, by this time, a single mother with 2 children. I pick up this letter out of my mailbox, and it says, "We understand that you have volunteered for astronaut training. Would you appear, would you be in Albuquerque on such and such a date at such and such a time?" I was really, I thought to myself, when did I do this? When did I volunteer for astronaut training? Because we had just put the men through, and I thought that was pretty great that they had put these men through astronaut tests, but at the time we were blowing up rockets on the launch pad, and we certainly didn't have any way to get anybody into space yet. So, the first thing that went through my mind was, if they're training people for astronauts, they must have something that they can put up there that nobody knows about. They didn't, but I thought they did. And if they do have something that'll go, I want to go with it.